There's a strange kind of loneliness that only appears when you're surrounded by people. You keep giving, keep showing up, keep smiling, and somehow you start to disappear. Not all at once, just a little more every time you say yes when your soul is screaming no. Buddhism teaches when your energy is scattered outward, your peace begins to fade. But when you turn inward, when you truly focus on yourself, you begin to return. This is not a story about selfishness. It's a story about remembering who you are and what happens when you finally stop apologizing for it. Later in this video, you'll hear about the quietest decision Rachel ever made and how it transformed not just her days, but her entire sense of self. It began with silence and ended with something far more powerful than applause. So if you've ever felt invisible in your own life, this journey is for you. Stay with us, and when the story ends, you might just choose yourself for the very first time. Subscribe to Lotus Light Teachings and let's walk this path together. It started on a Tuesday, not a dramatic one. Just the kind of Tuesday where the sky is gray and everything feels slightly behind schedule. Rachel Morgan, age 49, sat in her car outside the grocery store, still holding the steering wheel even though the engine had been off for 10 minutes. The air was still, her hands were still, but inside her chest there was a heaviness she couldn't name. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat there, like her body was waiting for a permission her mind would give, the kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from being stretched too thin for too long. And that's when it happened. A whisper in her head, quiet but piercing. I don't even know who I am anymore. That sentence landed like a bell in a quiet temple. Rachel had once been a vibrant woman, curious, artistic, even stubborn in the best way. She used to paint. She loved early morning fog and jazz records and making pancakes from scratch on Sundays. But somewhere between raising her daughter, pleasing her parents, saying yes to every work request, and holding a marriage together long past its expiration date, those parts of her had slowly gone missing. She hadn't noticed the moment she began to vanish. That's the cruel part of it. It doesn't happen all at once. It's not like a fire. It's like a slow fade, like colors draining from a photograph left in the sun too long. Little by little, she became the version of herself that everyone else needed, and forgot the one she actually was. She kept everything running. That's what she told herself. She kept the house in order, kept her daughter on track, kept her job stable, kept her smile ready, but inside she felt like a room with no furniture, functional, presentable, but utterly empty. And what's worse, no one noticed, because Rachel was so good at hiding it. That Tuesday, she realized something terrifying. She had become a supporting character in her own life. And the worst part? She had written herself that way. She never asked for anything. She never said what she needed. She never made herself the center of her own attention. And so, like anything neglected, her spirit began to wilt. There's a phrase in Buddhist teachings that says, "You cannot pour tea from an empty cup." But what if the cup was never filled in the first place? That night, Rachel went home, made dinner, checked homework, and smiled at the right moments. No one would have guessed that she was unraveling inside, that while everyone else was eating, she was mentally standing at the edge of a cliff called burnout. that while her daughter talked about school, Rachel was silently wondering, is this all there is for me? She went to bed early that night, or at least she pretended to. She laid in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional passing car, the soft tick of the hallway clock, and then the question returned, louder this time. When did I stop being my own priority? Rachel couldn't answer it. But she remembered flashes. The time she canceled her painting class because her ex-husband said it was selfish. The night she stayed up till 3 a.m. baking cupcakes for a PTA event no one thanked her for. The years she worked overtime to prove she was dedicated, only to be overlooked for promotion again and again. Every one of those choices seemed small at the time, but now, looking back, they felt like tiny betrayals. Not by others, by herself. And that's when the shame crept in, because when you finally wake up to the truth that you've abandoned yourself, it stings. You remember all the times you said, "I'm fine," when you weren't. All the times you smiled while your soul begged for rest. All the times you agreed to things you didn't want, just to avoid conflict. But Buddhism teaches that awakening doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it feels like grief. Because to truly wake up, you have to realize how long you've been asleep. Rachel lay there in the dark with nothing but her breath. And for the first time in years, she didn't reach for her phone. She didn't try to distract herself. She just stayed with the ache, the aching truth that she had built a life of service without self. That's when the second whisper came. This isn't living. This is maintaining. And Rachel didn't want to maintain anymore. There's another Buddhist teaching she remembered from a retreat she attended years ago, long before her life became so crowded. The teacher had said, before you serve the world, you must return to yourself. A grounded mind serves better than a scattered one. Rachel had nodded politely at the time. She didn't understand the depth of it. But now, lying alone in the dark, she finally did. She wasn't grounded. She was scattered, tossed like a leaf in the storm of other people's needs, lost in a blur of doing. And she knew no one was coming to rescue her. Not her boss, not her parents, not her ex, not her ex, not even her daughter. This was her work now. Not fixing anyone else. Not pleasing. Not performing. But remembering. Returning to herself. She didn't sleep that night. But for once, it wasn't because of stress. It was because a part of her had reawakened, and it wouldn't go back to sleep. The next morning, something strange happened. Rachel stood in front of the bathroom mirror and looked into her own eyes, not to check for wrinkles or fix her makeup, but to truly see herself. She placed a hand over her chest, and then she said it aloud. I miss you. It was the simplest act, but in that one sentence something cracked open, a tiny fissure in the armor of years, a small beginning, not dramatic, not a lightning bolt, just a breath, a shift, a breath. A yes whispered only to herself. Because before any transformation, there is recognition. Before any rising, there is noticing. I'm not okay, and that matters. Rachel didn't have a plan. She didn't have clarity. But she had a seed, and as any gardener knows, seeds don't bloom overnight. They need time. They need space. They need care. So that morning she did one thing differently. She took her coffee to the porch, wrapped herself in a blanket, left her phone inside, left her phone inside, and just sat, with the wind, the birds, the sound of nothing. And for the first time in years, maybe decades, Rachel Morgan didn't rush. She didn't scroll. She didn't plan. She didn't do. She just was. It felt foreign, but it also felt like home. And so began her return. The day Rachel decided to visit Elijah was another quiet one. Overcast skies, air thick with early fall. The trees had begun their gentle shedding, leaves fluttering to the ground like tired thoughts. She hadn't seen Elijah in nearly 12 years. They were close once, back in college, back when life felt wide and full of color, before responsibilities became chains disguised as duty. They had shared poetry and long walks in silence. Rachel remembered how Elijah always listened more than he spoke, how he once spent an entire evening sitting with a woman who was grieving without saying a word, and how somehow that said everything. Now, according to a mutual friend, he'd become a practicing Buddhist, not a monk, not cloaked in orange robes, just someone who'd chosen stillness over speed, clarity over ambition. She emailed him on a whim. "I don't know what I'm looking for, but I feel like I'm drowning," he replied the same evening. "Come over, no need to explain." So she did. Elijah lived just outside town, in a small cottage wrapped in ivy and quiet. When Rachel pulled up the gravel drive, she felt her shoulders tense. What was she doing here? Talking to someone she hadn't seen in over a decade? Was she looking for advice? Permission? Rescue? He opened the door before she knocked. Same calm eyes, same unhurried presence. "Hey," he said softly. Rachel tried to smile. "It's been a while." He stepped aside and gestured in. "Too long. But you made it. That's what matters." The living room smelled of sandalwood and lemon tea. No TV, no buzzing devices, just a bookshelf full of well-loved texts and a wide-open window letting in the breeze. Rachel sat on the floor cushion he offered. He poured her tea. No small talk. He poured her tea. No small talk. No pretense. And yet, she felt more seen than she had in years. Minutes passed before either of them spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. "I feel like I've lost myself," she said. "Like I've been everyone for everyone else, and now I don't know how to be anyone at all." Elijah nodded. "That's the real kind of tired." She looked down at the tea, unable to meet his gaze. "I thought doing the right things would make me feel full. Family, career, service. But I feel like a house full of furniture where no one lives." He smiled gently. "You built a home for everyone except yourself." The sentence hit her like thunder in a silent field. She looked up, eyes stinging. "How do I even begin to fix that?" Elijah didn't answer right away. Instead, he placed his own cup down, sat a little straighter, and said, "You don't fix it, Rachel. You return." Silence again, not awkward, just vast. "You've spent years running from one thing to the next," he continued, "trying to be a good mother, a good daughter, a good employee. But none of that means anything if you're not first a good friend to yourself." She inhaled deeply, the air cold in her chest. "I don't even know how to be that." He shrugged lightly. "You already are. The fact that you're sitting here, listening to yourself, that's the beginning. The whisper of awakening." Rachel blinked. "Awakening? It's not some dramatic enlightenment, he said. It's quieter than that. Softer, like a room you didn't know existed in your own home. And then one day you walk in and remember you used to love this place. And you want to stay. She laughed, but it cracked. Why does it hurt so much? Because waking up means realizing how long you've been asleep. He leaned forward. Buddha never said life wouldn't be painful, but he taught that suffering is different. Suffering is what we add to the pain, through resistance, through avoidance, through forgetting ourselves. Rachel looked out the window. Leaves danced in the wind like they didn't mind being pulled in every direction. I think I've forgotten what I want, she said softly. Elijah nodded. Then sit in the forgetting. That's where remembering begins. They spent the next half hour in silence. Tea refilled, breaths slow. A small bird landed on the porch railing, looked around, then flew off. Rachel felt something in her chest unwind. Not heal, not transform, just loosen. She turned to Elijah. What do I do now? He smiled. You stop doing. She waited. You listen, he said. You sit. You notice. You stop trying to fix everything. Buddhism calls it mindfulness. But that's just a fancy way of saying, be here on purpose. Rachel nodded slowly. It sounded too simple, too passive, but something about it felt deeply right. He walked her to the door. Before she left, he placed a small worn book in her hand. The Miracle of Mindfulness by Thich Nhat. Elijah, she asked, will this fix me? He grinned. No, but it'll help you stop trying to be fixed. On the drive home, she didn't turn on the radio. She drove with the windows down. For the first time in months, maybe years, she listened to her breath. In, out, in. That evening, she put her daughter to bed and didn't open her laptop. She didn't clean the kitchen, didn't reply to the backlog of texts. She sat on her porch again, tea in hand, wrapped in that same blanket, and opened the book. The first sentence read, drink your tea slowly and reverently, as if it is the axis on which the world turns. Rachel smiled. For the first time in a long time, she had no urge to scroll, solve, or speak. She just sat and listened and breathed. In the quiet, she heard it again. Not a voice, not even a thought, just a feeling, a whisper. You're still here. And that was enough. There's something sacred about a decision made in silence, not the kind declared loudly or written in ink, but the kind that forms slowly like fog lifting from a valley, revealing something that was always there, just hidden. The morning after her visit to Elijah's home, Rachel did something she hadn't done in years. She didn't check her phone, not when she woke up, not while brushing her teeth, not even when she passed the glowing screen lighting up with notifications. Instead, she poured her coffee, walked to the kitchen window, and stood still. The world outside looked unchanged. The same overcast sky, the same neighbor's dog barking, the same recycling bins tipped over from last night's wind. But inside her something small had shifted. She had no name for it yet, but it felt like space. For the first time in years, she didn't rush to fill it. Her daughter, Emily, stumbled in a few minutes later, hair messy, hoodie half-zipped. Mom, did you sign the permission slip? It's due today? Rachel turned slowly. It's on the counter, honey. Already signed. Emily grabbed it and mumbled a thanks without looking up, then disappeared down the hall. No smile, no thank you hug, no acknowledgement of the little things Rachel did daily. Rachel stood there holding her coffee, watching her daughter's retreating footsteps, and something inside whispered, "You don't have to disappear to keep others comfortable." That morning at exactly 9:00 a.m., her phone buzzed. It was her manager. "Quick favor. Can you jump on an unscheduled call at 9:15? Rachel stared at the screen. The old version of her would have dropped everything. The old version would have said yes, even if it meant skipping breakfast. The old version always said yes. But this morning, she didn't. She didn't even respond right away. Instead, she sat down, took another sip, watched a bird hop along the back fence, and then carefully she typed, "I'm unavailable until 10. I'll join after I've finished what I'm already working on." She hit send. No emoji, no over-apology, no justification. Just a boundary. She sat there for a moment, heart thumping louder than it should. It was a small thing, a polite deferral, but to Rachel it felt enormous, because it wasn't about the call. It was about the pattern. All these years she had bent herself in 1,000 directions to stay agreeable, to stay needed, to stay liked, but in doing so she'd forgotten what it meant to stay honest with herself. And now here she was, choosing discomfort over self-abandonment, even just for an hour. Later that day, she took another step. At lunch, instead of eating at her desk like always, she walked outside, found a small bench under a tree near her office, left her phone inside. Just her phone inside. Just her sandwich. The wind. She chewed slowly, watching leaves fall like prayers. For a moment she felt strange, exposed even, like someone who had forgotten how to just sit, how to be. But soon the silence began to feel like a warm coat, and under it, she heard a soft inner voice she hadn't heard in a long time. "I miss this." She didn't need to ask what this meant. It meant stillness, solitude, something hers. That night, after dishes were done, and Emily was holed up in her room, Rachel lit a candle. Not for a holiday, not for someone else, just because she wanted the light. She opened her journal, the one she hadn't touched since 2019, and wrote, "I said no today. I didn't apologize. I didn't explain. I just said no. And I'm still here." The next morning, she tried again. She turned off her notifications for the first 2 hours of the day. She played soft piano music while answering emails. She drank her coffee slowly, letting the warmth remind her she was alive, not just functional. By Friday, something unexpected happened. Her coworker Brian, usually the loudest voice in any meeting, paused after one of her suggestions and said, "Actually, that's a really good point, Rachel. Thanks for bringing that up." She blinked. When was the last time someone had publicly acknowledged her value? Not because she over-delivered, not because she scrambled behind the scenes, but because she spoke from her center. It felt foreign, and yet true. Elijah's words returned to her. When you stop chasing, you start glowing. Rachel didn't feel like she was glowing yet, but something inside her had lit up, and she was protecting that flame now. Later that night, Rachel and Emily sat in the car after picking up groceries. Emily was scrolling through her phone when she muttered, "Hey, Mom, I noticed you've been kinda different lately." Rachel turned slightly. "Different how?" Emily shrugged. "I don't know. Calmer, less stressed, I guess." Rachel smiled. "That's a good thing, right?" Emily looked up from her phone. "Yeah, it is." They didn't say much more, but in that quiet, Rachel felt something soften between them. Because here's the truth Buddhism points to again and again. You don't have to demand respect. You become magnetic by being aligned. When you honor your own space, others begin to recognize its shape too. Over the weekend, Rachel tried something radical. She took a day off, not a vacation, not a doctor's appointment, just a day for herself. She walked a trail near the lake, left her phone in the car, sat by the water for an hour just watching the ripples, listening to the breath of the earth. She wasn't productive. She wasn't anyone's helper. She just was. And in that quiet, she remembered something. There is nothing passive about peace. Peace takes courage. Peace requires boundaries. Peace asks you to stop playing small so others feel comfortable. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, she whispered a new promise to herself. I don't owe anyone an explanation for choosing myself. That night, she went home and did something she never used to do. She turned off her phone completely by 9 p.m. No calls, no texts, no scrolling. And as she lay in bed, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like home. Discipline doesn't arrive with a bang. It doesn't knock loudly on your door or flood your soul with motivation. More often it shows up as a whisper, a quiet choice, a single step taken before your emotions have had a chance to argue. For Rachel, that whisper first came at 5:45 a.m. on a Monday. It had been 3 weeks since she visited Elijah. 2 weeks since her first, no 7 days since her silent walk by the lake. She had expected, maybe hoped, that a few small changes would be enough. That clarity would sweep in like a strong wind, clearing the clutter. But instead the fog lingered. Because the truth is, awakening is not a one-time decision. It's a daily one. That morning her alarm buzzed before the sun rose. She'd set it the night before, intentionally, firmly. Her goal? To start a simple practice, 10 minutes of silence, every morning before anything else. No phone, no distractions, just her breath. But now, lying in bed, warmth still clinging to her body, every excuse crawled into her head. I'll start tomorrow. I didn't sleep well. 10 minutes won't matter. I didn't sleep. The same thoughts that had robbed her of herself for years. But this time she sat up. Not because she felt like it, but because she had promised herself she would. She wrapped a shawl over her shoulders, padded into the living room, and sat cross-legged on the floor. It was quiet, still dark. A soft rain tapped against the window. She closed her eyes and she breathed. In, out, in, out. For the first 30 seconds it felt peaceful. Then her mind began to scream. The email she forgot to send, her daughter's field trip lunch, the laundry piling up. her aging parents and their latest request. She wanted to open her eyes, to reach for her phone, to check off just one thing so she'd feel in control. But she didn't. Instead, she returned to her breath. In, out. When the timer rang, she almost cried. Not from stress, but from awe. She had kept a promise to herself, and that feeling, though quiet, was powerful. That became her rhythm. 10 minutes each morning, not to escape life, but to meet it. Clear-eyed and calm. It wasn't always graceful. Some mornings, her knees ached. Some mornings she forgot to set the timer. Some mornings she sat in a fog of anger or sadness and didn't know why. But she sat anyway, because as Elijah had told her, right effort isn't about perfection. It's about showing up again and again. That phrase stuck with her. Right effort. Not forcing, not faking, not chasing, not hiding. Just effort directed wisely. Rachel began to apply it elsewhere. Instead of saying yes out of guilt, she paused, breathed, asked, "Is this aligned with what I really need today?" Instead of reaching for her phone at every spare moment, she paused, breathed, and chose whether to engage rather than react by habit. Instead of skipping meals or eating standing up, she paused, breathed, and sat down, even if just for 5 minutes. These weren't revolutionary actions. They didn't look impressive. They wouldn't go viral. But they were hers. And over time, they added up. At work, she began blocking an hour of focused time each day. No meetings, no multitasking. She called it sacred work. Her manager resisted at first, but when Rachel started delivering better results, the complaints stopped. At home, she created a quiet corner for herself. Just a small chair by the window, a candle, and a notebook. That became her evening ritual. 10 minutes to reflect, reset, and thank herself for one small thing she did that day to honor her needs. Sometimes it was big. Speaking her truth in a difficult conversation. Sometimes it was small. Drinking water when she wanted another coffee. But always it was something. Because Rachel had learned that transformation doesn't come from grand declarations. It comes from repetition. From choosing again and again to live in alignment, not autopilot. And that kind of discipline, it doesn't feel like punishment. It feels like love in motion. She remembered what Elijah said once during college. Most people wait to feel motivated. But Buddhists don't wait. They move with the breath, not the mood. Rachel began to realize that her old habits, overgiving, overcommitting, over-explaining, weren't just personality traits. They were defense mechanisms, ways to feel worthy, ways to avoid stillness, ways to control outcomes. Ways to control outcome. But discipline, the kind rooted in Buddhist practice, was different. It wasn't about control. It was about returning, again and again, to what matters, to who she was. One Saturday afternoon, while cleaning her room, Rachel came across an old photo from her 30s. She was hiking, laughing, hair wild, eyes clear. She barely recognized herself, but instead of feeling grief, she smiled. Not because she wanted to go back, but because for the first time she believed she could go forward with that same aliveness, but deeper, wiser. That night, she wrote in her journal. Discipline isn't a cage. It's a path back to myself. 3 months passed. One evening, she and Emily sat on the porch in rare silence. The air was cool, and the sky had that deep purple hue that only happens in October. Emily broke the silence first. "Mom," she said, "you've changed." Rachel turned. "In a good way?" Emily nodded. "Yeah, you're calmer, like really calm. But also more you." Rachel looked out into the dusk. "I think I'm finally listening." Emily grinned. To me, Rachel laughed softly. To myself. And that was the truth. Because what started as 10 minutes of silence had become a new rhythm of living. Not fast, not loud, but steady, present, disciplined, not to impress anyone, but to stay rooted in what mattered. Rachel had stopped waiting for motivation. She had begun trusting her intention. And each day she showed up, not perfectly, but faithfully. She built something invisible but unshakable. Her center. It happened on a Thursday. Rachel hadn't planned it. She hadn't rehearsed some great act of strength or vowed to turn a new leaf that day. It was just another ordinary weekday morning, the kind that slides past you if you don't pay attention. The air was cool. October light filtered through the blinds like diluted honey. She was standing at the kitchen counter, brewing her second cup of coffee, when the email came in. The subject line read, "Concerns about your communication tone. Please review." It was from Vanessa, her colleague of 8 years, a woman Rachel had supported, covered for, encouraged, and, on more than one occasion, gently defended in leadership meetings. Vanessa was younger, sharper, louder, and increasingly critical. Rachel stared at the subject line. Her stomach dropped, her chest tightened. And just like that, the old wiring lit up like a switchboard. What did I do wrong? Did I sound too direct? Did someone come correct? Did someone complain about me? I need to fix this. Right now, she felt her heart race. That old reflex of self-doubt, polished by years of over-performing, over-apologizing, over-justifying. She clicked the email. It was a curt message, vague in tone, accusing her of being dismissive in a recent team thread. It referenced no specific incident, no quoted message, just a feeling, Vanessa's feeling. The old Rachel would have reacted in minutes. Crafted a carefully worded, empathetic reply. Apologized even if she didn't understand. Offered to talk. Asked for clarity. Then blamed herself for even needing it. But that morning, something else emerged first. Not panic, not defensiveness, just breath. A slow, deliberate inhale, and a choice. She closed the laptop, not forever, not in defiance, just for now. She picked up her mug, stepped outside onto the back porch, and let the sun warm her shoulders. The garden was quiet, except for the soft rattle of leaves in the wind, and as she stood there, not reacting, not rushing, she felt something rise in her she hadn't known she possessed. Stability, not the false stability of control, but the quiet steadiness of someone who no longer needs to please everyone to feel worthy. That was the moment she realized just how far she'd come. Not because she didn't feel the sting, but because she didn't let the sting steer her. Vanessa's words were still there. The tone still bothered her, but Rachel no longer believed that every discomfort was a call to action. She didn't need to fix someone else's discomfort at the cost of her own clarity. That evening, after a calm and steady workday, she drafted a simple response. "Thanks for your feedback. If you'd like to clarify specific concerns, I'm open to discussing them with mutual respect and understanding. I'd appreciate concrete examples so I can respond with context. No apology, no defense, just grounded presence." She reread it 3 times, not to perfect it, but to ensure it aligned with who she was becoming. Then she sent it. And she let it go. She didn't check for a reply every hour. She didn't replay the interaction in her head 100 times. She didn't call 3 friends to ask if she had done something wrong. She returned to her breath, to her evening candle, to her quiet chair by the window, because Rachel had learned that inner peace isn't built through approval, it's built through alignment. And alignment often begins when you choose not to react. It wasn't that she was numb, quite the opposite. She felt everything. But now she watched what she felt. Like clouds across a sky, she observed her irritation, her insecurity, her old desire to over-explain, and she let them pass. That too was part of her discipline. Because in Buddhist practice, discipline is not force, it's presence, deep enough to notice the urge, and gentle enough to return without punishment. That night Elijah's words returned to her. The moment you stop reacting, you begin reclaiming your energy. The world will try to pull you, provoke you, define you, but you don't have to follow. You can stay rooted. You can stay home, in yourself. Rachel wrote 1 sentence in her journal that night. "Today, I didn't react, I responded. And even that I let go. There was no applause, no praise, no email congratulating her for her growth. But inside, something powerful stirred. A sense of quiet triumph. She remembered a Buddhist parable Elijah once shared, about a monk who remained calm while others criticized him. When asked why he didn't respond, the monk replied, "If someone offers you a gift and you do not accept it, to whom does the gift belong?" Rachel closed her eyes and whispered into the stillness, "I am not taking the gift today." The next morning, Vanessa responded, vaguely again, but with less heat. Rachel skimmed it. No reaction, no spiral. Instead, she got up, brewed her coffee, lit her morning candle, and sat. 10 minutes, just breath. And as the timer rang, she smiled. Because that moment of stillness, that quiet space she chose over reaction, had more power than any performance she could have given. And she finally understood. Some days, the greatest strength is not in what you say, but in what you allow to pass unspoken. Some wounds don't bleed. They don't scream. They don't bruise. They don't leave marks people can point to and say, "Look, here's where it happened." No. Some wounds are invisible, and those are often the ones that last the longest. Rachel didn't know when hers had started. There wasn't one clear trauma. No single moment of shattering, just a series of quiet betrayals. Tiny moments she turned away from herself, again and again, in the name of keeping the peace. It began, perhaps, the first time she cried alone in the kitchen because her husband hadn't come home on their anniversary. Or maybe it was the day she returned to work 3 weeks after giving birth, because they really needed her. and she didn't want to let anyone down. Or maybe it was the years she spent saying, "I'm fine," when she was anything but. Rachel had lived much of her adult life in motion, always moving forward, always showing up. And when people told her how strong she was, she smiled and said, "Thank you," like it was a compliment, like it wasn't actually a quiet way of saying, "I have no choice but to keep surviving." But now, in the stillness of her new rituals, something unexpected was happening. She began to feel it, the ache, the grief, the tightness in her chest that didn't come from emails or appointments, but from everything she had tucked away year after year, because there was no time to feel it then. It started one night while folding laundry. She picked up one of Emily's old sweatshirts. Faded, small, soft with memory. She held it to her chest and wept, not for anything specific, not because anything had happened, but because she hadn't cried like that in years. She hadn't given herself the space. And now, as the tears fell into the cotton, she realized something shocking. This wasn't sadness. This was release. The wound wasn't new, but the permission to feel it, that was. That night she didn't rush to clean up, didn't hide in the bathroom, didn't scold herself for falling apart. Instead, she sat on the floor, let the basket tip over, let the socks spill out, and she stayed with the ache. In Buddhism, she remembered, this was the beginning of healing, acknowledging the wound, without shame, without story, without blame. She thought about the teachings of Thich, how he spoke of holding your suffering like a crying child, not to silence it, but to comfort it. So Rachel held herself, arms wrapped around her knees, and whispered words she once wished someone had said to her. "I see you. You didn't deserve to carry it all alone. You can rest now." She didn't need someone else to forgive her. She needed to forgive herself for the years she lost pretending, for the moments she doubted her worth, for the energy she spent proving what was always true, that she mattered. The next morning, she lit a new candle in her quiet corner. This one was for grief, not as something to fix, but as something to honor. She opened her journal and wrote, "I have been strong for so long that I forgot softness is also holy. I forgive myself for forgetting myself. I am learning how to let it hurt without letting it define me." That day, Rachel did something she had avoided for a long time. She opened the photo album from the year of her divorce, page after page of forced smiles. Family dinners where no one made eye contact. A birthday where she blew out the candles alone, in a shirt that still smelled like grief. She didn't look away this time. She didn't close the book in panic. She let the pain come, let the memories sting, let the truth rise. Because Buddhism teaches pain is inevitable, suffering is optional, and suffering, Rachel realized, was the story she had kept telling herself. It didn't matter. It wasn't that bad. I'm over it. But she wasn't over it. She had just outpaced it, and now she was finally slowing down enough for it to catch up. But here's what surprised her. When she let it in, it didn't destroy her. It softened her. It grounded her. It brought her closer to herself. Healing, she realized, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about making peace with it, letting it speak, letting it teach, letting it go. That night, she lay in bed and did something different. Instead of replaying her to-do list, she replayed her forgiveness, the things she'd buried, The words she'd never self she had once been ashamed of. The versions of herself she had once been ashamed of. She imagined them all sitting in a circle. The young, hopeful Rachel. The heartbroken Rachel. The angry Rachel. The silent, exhausted, unseen Rachel. And she whispered to each one, "I forgive you. I honor you. You were trying to survive." And you did. That was the beginning of her deepest healing. Not through therapy appointments or big breakthroughs, but through daily compassion, the kind she used to offer everyone else without hesitation, but never herself. From that day forward, Rachel made healing a ritual. Some days it looked like sitting in silence. Other days it looked like writing a letter to someone she'd never sent. Some days it was as simple as placing her hand on her heart and saying, "I'm here. I'm listening." She didn't always know what she needed, but she knew what she wouldn't do anymore. She would not run her pain, because she had finally learned it's not the pain that destroys us. It's the distance we place between us and the truth. And now, Rachel had chosen to close that gap. Not all at once, but moment by breath. There's a silence that feels like punishment. And then there's the kind of silence that sets you free. Rachel had spent most of her life haunted by noise, not the external kind, but the internal chatter of approval seeking. She didn't recognize it at first. It wore polite disguises. Am I being fair? Did I say that the right way? Did they think I sounded too cold? Should I follow up? Just in case? It didn't matter if it was at work with her daughter, in social groups, or even in line at the grocery store. A tiny part of her was always scanning. Do they like me? And the thing was, she didn't even need praise. She just needed not to disappoint anyone. But Buddhism teaches a quiet truth. The desire to be liked is still a form of craving, and craving always binds us to suffering. Rachel first began to see it clearly during a casual lunch with a few coworkers. She had said something, a harmless opinion about a TV show, and one of the women responded with a half laugh, half scoff. "Oh, you like that?" It was a simple comment, unimportant, fleeting, but Rachel's body reacted like she'd been accused of something. Her heart fluttered. Her face wormed. She opened her mouth to backtrack, to explain why she liked it, to neutralize any discomfort. But then she caught herself. She saw it. The reaction, the habit, the unconscious scramble to be safe by being liked. And she stopped. She smiled instead. "Yeah, I did." Then she took a sip of her water. No apology, no defense, no apology, no follow-up. And something in her broke free. That evening she sat in her quiet corner, candle-lit, tea warm in her hands, and wrote, "How much of my life has been shaped by trying to be easy to love?" That sentence haunted her in the best way. She thought about how often she had molded herself, softened her opinions, shrunk her needs, dimmed her light, just to keep the peace, just to keep being liked, just to avoid judgment. But approval, she realized, was a treadmill with no off switch. You get a compliment, and your nervous system says, "Good. Keep doing that." You get silence, and your mind says, "Change. Adjust. Fix yourself." She had become fluent in reading other people's reactions, but illiterate in understanding her own truth. And that night she made a new vow. No more editing herself for applause. Because the truth was, some people were never going to clap. No matter how kind she was, no matter how careful, no matter how hard she tried. And that wasn't a failure. That was freedom. She began to notice how deep the need ran. The way she changed the tone of her emails. The way she added just or I think or maybe to soften her speech. The way she held back hard truths out of fear that she'd be too much. She began stripping those habits away one by one. At work, she stopped over-explaining. She said what needed to be said, directly, respectfully, clearly, and then let it be. Some people didn't respond well, but most did. And more importantly, she did. She felt her energy returning, her breath deepening, her spine straightening. Because every time she chose truth over performance, she gained something sacred, her own approval. Emily noticed first. "Mom," she said one night over dinner, "you don't seem so worried anymore." Rachel laughed. "Worried about what?" "I don't know," Emily shrugged. "About what people think. You used to second-guess everything. Now you just say stuff." Rachel smiled. "It feels better that way." Emily nodded. "Yeah, it does." Later that night, Rachel sat in bed and reflected. Approval had been her currency for most of her life. She earned it, chased it, collected it like trophies that turned to dust as soon as she looked away. But now, she was finally building a home that didn't depend on anyone else's key. And that was the real shift. Not a new job, not a new relationship, but a new self-trust. A confidence not built on loud declarations, but quiet knowing. That weekend she went hiking alone. No selfies, no shared posts, just trees and sky and her own breath. At the top of the hill, she sat on a rock and whispered to no one, "I approve of myself." It felt strange, but real. It felt like the start of something she should have said decades ago. And in that moment, high above the noise of the world, she knew the most powerful approval is the kind no one can give you, and no one can take away. It's a strange kind of power, realizing you don't have to care about everything. That your peace, your joy, your presence are finite. And unless you protect them, they will be spent on things that never deserved them in the first place. Rachel discovered this not through a grand revelation, but through exhaustion. It was a Sunday afternoon. The laundry was done. The fridge was stocked. Emily was in her room, earbuds in, lost in music. The house was quiet. The light outside had turned golden, that perfect hue that only autumn knows how to paint. And yet, Rachel felt drained. Not physically, emotionally. She hadn't fought with anyone, hadn't been overwhelmed, but still, a kind of tiredness lingered in her chest like a weight that couldn't be explained. She sat on the porch with her journal open, candle flickering beside her, and asked herself softly, "Why am I tired when nothing happened?" And the answer came. Because she was still carrying too much, not on the outside, but in her mind. She was still thinking about the friend who hadn't texted back, still wondering if her coworker was upset over her boundary last week, still feeling guilty for not visiting her parents that weekend, still second-guessing whether she should join that group dinner she didn't even want to go to. And suddenly it hit her. It wasn't her life that was exhausting. It was what she was choosing to care about. In Buddhist teaching, there is a simple but powerful truth. Attachment is the root of suffering. But attachment doesn't always look like clinging to possessions or people. Sometimes it looks like overcaring about everything, about everyone, all the time. Rachel closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "I can't carry all of it, and I don't have to." That night, she made a list, not a to-do list, a to-care list. On one side, the things she was currently giving energy to. On the other, the things that actually mattered to her soul. The difference was shocking. On the first list, worrying if Emily's silence meant something was wrong, stressing over a delayed project at work, overthinking a comment from her sister, feeling guilty for resting, wondering if she should have posted more on social media on the social. Second list, her own peacetime in nature, morning silence, deep connection, loving herself well, letting Emily grow in her own way. She stared at the paper and let out a long, slow breath. "No wonder I'm tired." She realized she had been investing her emotional currency into things that brought no return, like pouring water into sand. And it wasn't sustainable anymore. That week, she began shrinking her circle of concern and growing her circle of presence. She let go of the compulsion to reply instantly to every message. She stopped overthinking every silence. She started asking herself one simple question before giving her energy away. Will this matter in 5 years? If not, should it matter now? Most of the time, the answer was no. She began deleting apps she never used, unsubscribing from emails she never read, letting go of friendships that only existed out of guilt or obligation, not with anger, but with clarity. Because in Buddhist wisdom, detachment is not rejection. It's remembering what's sacred. Rachel created new rituals of protection. She set boundaries, not just on her time, but on her attention. She began every day by listing 3 things she chose to care about that day. Just 3. Not because nothing else mattered, but because not everything deserves her whole soul. One morning, Emily asked, "Why are you writing in that journal every day now?" Rachel smiled. "It helps me remember what to care about." Emily nodded. "I think I need one of those." Rachel handed her a blank notebook that had been sitting in the drawer for years. Later that night, she found Emily in the kitchen, pen in hand, writing quietly. Rachel didn't say a word, because some things don't need to be taught. They just need to be lived. And that's when she realized, by choosing what to care about, she wasn't just reclaiming her life. She was modeling freedom to her daughter, to herself, to the quiet spaces she once abandoned in the name of approval. One Sunday, she sat by the lake again. The same bench from months before, the same water, the same breeze, but a very different woman. This time, she didn't come with heaviness. She came with lightness. She watched the ripples, listened to the trees, and whispered to the sky, "I care about this." And with that, she exhaled the things that no longer belonged to her. The old roles, the old rows, the old weight, the invisible burdens she had carried for far too long. She didn't need to hold everything. She just needed to hold what mattered. And now, She finally knew the difference. Maybe Rachel's story felt familiar to you. Maybe you too have spent years tending to everyone else's needs, while your own heart waited patiently in the background. Maybe you've said yes when you meant no. Maybe you've shrunk your truth to keep the peace. Maybe, like Rachel, you forgot what it feels like to simply be yours. But here's the gentle truth Buddhism reminds us. You are allowed to return, no matter how long you've been gone. No matter how far you've drifted, you are allowed to choose yourself. Not in a loud or selfish way, but in a sacred, steady inner way. And when you do, you begin to glow differently, quietly, but unmistakably. This isn't the end of Rachel's journey, and it isn't the end of yours. It's just the beginning of walking home, to the part of you that never stopped waiting. So take your time, take your breath, and take this next step with softness. You don't need anyone's permission. You already have your own. If this story resonated with you, we invite you to stay, to sit with us in silence, to listen, to let go, to begin again. Thank you for being here. And until next time, may your peace be deep, may your boundaries be kind, and may your return be real.